key of G major here, and this isn't a structured lesson per se, so if that's what you're looking for, I'm just kind of going through a few details of what you can do with a triad, or, really any combination of notes that make up a chord, right? And you find yourself a good chord, and then you move up and down in that key, moving each note in that chord up or down one note in that key, 1 degree in that key, right? Which could be a half step or a whole step, or even maybe a 1.5 steps, and if you're playing some exotic scales or something like that. But with general, most major key, functions when you're playing most music, it's Western music especially, like, you're going to be playing with the major key pattern, right? We're talking about 2 whole steps, a half step, 3 whole steps, and a half step, right? And a half step being 1 fret, whole step being 2 frets, right here. But I'm just basically moving every note in each chord up 1 note or degree in that key. So for example, we'll just play these 3 notes, which are all notes in the key of G major. You can see we're actually playing right from the G Ionian mode here. And you play 2 whole octaves of G Ionian mode right here, right? From G to G, but we can take notes out of there and just do random chords, kind of. And you could do all kinds of combinations of notes in here and try to, and a lot of them could sound pretty good. But to kind of give yourself a little bit more structure, right, and many of your ideas possibly is just to kind of really, move each note up 1 degree or down a degree in each note of each chord, right? There's also different things you can do, like counterpoint, moving them in the opposite direction, or notes in the chord in the opposite direction, or maybe one's a pedal note kind of sorts, where another one's more of a little bit of a lead line, if you will. But just giving you some basics, right? But those are some more maybe advanced ideas, but just talking about, taking some of these chords right here, and right out of this Ionian mode, really. If you're a guitar player, it's going to help you develop your ear in a sense, right? So let me see. If you hum along with the notes of each triad too as well. That's another thing that can help you develop your ear a bit with, functionalities of multiple notes, or harmonies, I should say, right? So, but just you make different, progressions out of there, right, if you will. Then you might alter around some of those triads. You don't necessarily have to stay strictly in there, but the main thing is that you're generally, you're staying in the key that you're in, right? With the exception of any kind of unusual or passing notes that could come along in some way, which might be rare depending on how you're playing, what you're trying to do. But if you're staying in the key, we could, play some variations, just play around with that scale, that right here in this case, it's this Ionian finger pattern, which is the first finger pattern of a major key, right? In this case, we're talking about the key of G major, so this is a G note. We're playing this finger pattern down here. You might be familiar with it, right? 2, 4, 1, 2, 4. We're just in this 4 fret box right here. Each finger is playing the same fret all the way down, right? So it's 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 2, 4, 1, 2. Right, you're back on a G note again. So there's 3 G notes in here. One on the, this up here, and then one right here, and then down here. So those are all G notes that are also part of a G major bar chord. There you can see. That's like your main chord in the key of G major, right? But we can play other chords that actually have notes inside of the key. with just playing in the key and dropping down here right to an E minor chord, which is actually the relative minor for G major, right? Which is the sixth note in the key of G major, the E note, right? And then the seventh note being an F sharp right here. And this is the key of G major, right? So there is this one sharp note. And, you know, some of those could vary depending on whether you're playing more classically or thinking in terms of like sheet music or something like that, or the circle of Fifths. You might be thinking those notes can change. But, you know, as a guitar player, to keep it kind of simple, you know, we'd say an F sharp note, maybe, for example, right? Which is always F sharp. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, someone might call it a G flat. So it's the same note. But it could be in different context. But just for simplicity's sake, we're calling it an F sharp. Right? But if we hear G flat in another piece of music, hey, that's, you know, that means F sharp. Right? But it could be used in a different context, like I said, and relatively to a different key or progression. But, you know, right back here up to our home note, which is G again. Right? This a little bit. You can also do it on these strings down here too. Find different combinations of, you know. Let's see if we. Oh, whoops, that's not the key of G here, but this is. Right, I can move that up here and, right, or up here, or next one would be right here. So. I'm just, you know, it might take you a little time to formulate those, but you're just finding the next note in the key of whatever you're talking about, in this case, G major, right? And if you kind of understand that, you know, from wherever there's a G note in the key of G major, you're doing this major key pattern from the first note in that key pattern, the tonic note, which is going to be the Ionian mode, is the first note of Ionian mode, the first mode in a major key. There's, you know, the 7 major modes, or modes, I should say, of a major key. And I even had some other videos. I encourage you to check them out if you want to see each of those particular main, you know, those are like the mainstream modes, and there's other ways to like have different scales and so forth. But we're talking about westernized music structure, which is like 95%, 90%, you know, what we're talking about here in the Western key structure. So if you have a G major chord, you know, for example, if we go up to the next chord to the second degree and the key of G major is going to be the second note, which is we're following that whole step, half step, whole step, half step pattern to get back to our home note again, which is G over here on the same string. But if we were just to go down the strings, you could also play that 2/4, 1 2 4, 1 3 4. So it's the same thing, right? So you think of each string as kind of continuing what the string above it is doing, right? So if you go here, we're just going G, A, B, C, D. So instead of playing it all up like that, you know, we can go here, G, A, B, C, D, right? E, F, G, right? So the same note. But knowing that, you can kind of formulate, hey, this is from the G note, or even here in this G note, because we know those are both the same note, right? Then we can go whole step, half step from that G note, right? Whole step, half step, whole step, half step, and end up on a G note again up here, right? So that's how, you know, you can just kind of know. Now, like you said, you think of the way the strings relate a little bit. You can take this G note here, and that matches to there, right? And then down here, but, you know, this G note is also the way we would tune the G string. A lot of times with the basic tuning, kind of relative tuning, you tune this 5th fret of the D string, which is a G note, to the G string, open, the next string down, right? Make sure they match. So you can see where it's kind of continuing on the next string down. So this is the G note, this next note is a G sharp note, this is an A note, right? So down here, same thing, we have this open G string here, right? This 4th string down, that's a G note. The first fret is going to be a G sharp, and then an A, right? Just like we were doing up here. right? It's the same notes. It's on a different string, so it has some different sound quality to it. But as long as it's tuned right, it's going to be the same frequency of pitch, right? So, you can kind of see, and that's the way it is with all the strings going down, except for between the G string and the B string, it's a fret closer, right? Like when we tune here on the 4th fret with these two strings instead of the 5th fret like we do with these other strings. And even the last two, the B string, we hit this 5th fret, that's an E note, right? An E note, and match it to the open E string at the very bottom or high end, I should say, in pitch, but the bottom of the guitar physically. So we're matching those two notes to tune the guitar relatively. You want to make sure those two E's match well. Otherwise, we're a little off, and our tuning is a little off balance, intonation, etc. So you want to kind of compensate for that. If your guitar is not perfect, you can even kind of just making sure that those two match, and then kind of finding a middle ground, if you will, in your tuning. But that way, when you're playing your chords, they'll sound, harmonized. And you can add additional notes from the key in some of these, chords. The key of G, which most of the open strings fit. Actually, I think all the open strings fit into the key of G major. So a lot of times you can just leave those strings to ring out if you want to play something kind of spacey or move the bass around a little bit. I appreciate you listening, but let me know if this helps in any way. Maybe you can see some ideas, and you can do different combinations of 3 notes in the key. Like maybe, for example, maybe these 3 are all in the key of G major. If we move them all up 1 note, that would give us this chord right here, right? Then over here, but then over here we would get, sorry, somewhat. That's right here, I think. So, you'd have to kind of make sure you're hitting the right note on each triad progression, which means taking the time to formulate and make sure, wherever the G note is. Maybe, like, for example, I show you this G note here, and this G note here, and this G note matches, and of course our open G string should match that right there. Our open G string is another G, but there's also a G on every string, right? There's a G on the A string right here, right? So that's going to be, like right before the A, if you understand A through G in the music system, then it repeats itself. So, like, we think, hey, that's an A string, and we also could think, hey, this 12th fret right here is the same notes as the open string, it's just an octave higher, right? So we can say, hey, well, this 12th fret of the G string is also a G note, right? And the 12th fret of the A string is an A note, right? And so, we're thinking about, hey, we want to go right before the A note is going to be where our G note is at. And if you understand the 12 chromatic notes, you understand that between G and A, there is a note, right? That is typically, most commonly, probably called G sharp, right? That is G sharp. So, the G is actually going to be a whole step down. And the G sharp, right? There's G sharp, there's not going to be an A flat. Now, you could say an A flat, that would be the same note as a G sharp, same pitch. It's an enharmonic, and it could be used in different contexts depending on the key you're in. But for all practical purposes, it's the same note, right? So this G sharp note. But we have this A note here. We have this G note right here, right? That's another G note on the A string. So that should match right here, which should also match this G note up here, because this is 12 frets higher than this G note right here. Right, the 15th, the 3rd fret down here, and the 15th fret match just like the open and the 12th fret, right? So, give you a little bit of perspective if you're not fully aware of that. But, thinking about each string continuing, what would be continuing on one string, right? So, like if you're, example, like you said, going, this G, key of G, Now, even if we're just playing all 12 notes, it kind of does the same thing. You go 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're not just doing 4 frets here, we're doing 5. We're stretching the pinky on each one. We're doing 5 notes on each string. But if you want to continue it just with 4 notes at a time, you'd have to go back a fret, if that makes sense, on each one. So it would be like, right, that's continuous, like, right, it's the same thing, if that makes sense, right? So you can get an idea of a little more of how the guitar strings relate to each other in that sense. Anything I play right here is going to be, oh, whoops, right here. You kind of get a sense of, that's 5 frets down. So this 9th fret right here matches the 4th fret on the next string down, right? So right there, same notes, right? So if you were to just continue, you'd be like, if you were to continue at the same string, right? So instead of going way down here, we're starting from this to continue from where we leave off when we're up here. We're going, right, and then now we get to the G and the B string, it just stays on the same fret because it needs to be 1 fret closer, right? So, and then down to the E string, we move 1 fret back again, right? So maybe that gives you a little idea. Now, if you were to play 5 notes on each string, then it just goes down in a grid pattern, except for the B string is 1 fret higher, so it's right. So it actually stays on the same fret when you go to the next one down. So it's, when we go from the B to the E, it stays on the same fret because it's the same gap as these other strings were. So maybe this gives you a little bit of an idea of how the fretboard kind of relates in a few ways, and maybe it helps you in some ways thinking about triads and thinking about different combinations of notes and ways you can do that. Oh, whoops. Kind of not exactly doing them right here. You have to sit here and formulate them maybe and get familiar with a few patterns, and this will really help to increase your fretboard vocabulary in a sense, your natural sense of a lot of areas of the fretboard in many ways in a different key. Now remember also as well, like, you can move every note up in a pattern to do the next key. If we're playing in this key of G sharp, a G major, from like playing this chord that's like in the key of G major, these 3 notes, whatever they are, I don't know every chord name off the top of my head, but then we move right up here, right, that's the next chord in the key of G major, whatever we're doing here, this triad. But if we were just to move this same formation up 1 fret, right, those are going to be G sharp based note chord, right? G sharp, because this is now a G sharp bass note right there, right? But we wouldn't necessarily play the open strings. Maybe they might not fit in there. Think about the open strings are staying in the same notes that they were, unless you add a bar, right, to compensate for it. Which of course you can do with some people use capos. I never would like to use one, but it might work for you for some reasons. Maybe it's the right thing. I don't know. But, you get the idea is that whenever you move an open chord up, right, like an A minor, for example, move it up a fret, and then make a B flat minor, you're going to have to add this bar right here, right? Then a B minor, then a C minor, C sharp minor, D minor, right? E flat minor, E minor. Should make sense. Should match our E minor open over here. And it does, right? So, but there's 12 notes, right? And you go back and maybe look at the 12 note pattern and understand it better, understand how some of these occidentals can have different names in different contexts. Like I say, you might call something might be a D sharp, but it's the same thing as an E flat, but in another key it might be considered a D sharp. Or if you're looking at written music, sheet music, for example, a lot of times it's indicated where it shows sharps and flats that are in the key at the beginning of a staff, and you'll get an idea that sometimes it's showing you that a note's different from the way it was in another song, because the key signature is different, the modal structure is different, and so that's why it might be like that. But hey, this is just a, not kind of a little bit of a ramble, but somewhat of a little bit of a lesson on some kind of harmonizing and using triads, maybe a little bit, maybe gives you a little bit of a foundation to start with. Maybe you work from here and try something in some other keys, or get used to, one pattern, one key, one scale, one mode. Maybe work your way up to developing the next mode from it by moving every note up one note in that key, 1 degree in that key, which, like I said, could be a half step or a whole step, in the regular standard major key. Unless you're playing any exotic keys or scales, you shouldn't have to think about that too much. It's always either a half step or a whole step from each other every next note in any given major key, if that makes sense. And maybe this is given with some stuff you already know. Maybe you're a beginner, intermediate, maybe even more advanced, and this is already like, hey, you already get, I'm not doing it, not showing you anything new. But hey, maybe you like this lesson, and let me know if you get something out of it. Certainly appreciate you liking and subscribing. You might even see a couple other videos or another video that looks interesting, or even go back and check out my channel for some other miniature lessons on things like modes, learning by ear, and, chord structure, progressions, a few ideas on that as well. And in the meantime, we'll see you in the next video.